The old house sat on the edge of a forgotten road, nestled between towering trees that clawed at the sky. The evening was thick with silence, the kind that seeped into the bones, heavy and suffocating. Inside, the faint crackle of a candle flickered softly, its light dancing across the weathered walls, casting long shadows that twisted like strange creatures from some far-off place. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little further than it should, playing tricks on the mind. The house, though empty, felt alive in ways that couldn't be explained, as if something stirred just beyond the realm of the visible. The main character, sitting alone by a cold, rain-speckled window, stared into the dark expanse of the forest that sprawled out beyond the house. The trees, tall and skeletal, seemed to sway even though there was no breeze to move them. The night was unnaturally still, and yet there was something unsettling, a sensation, like being watched, crawled up the spine. Their fingers tightened around the mug of tea they hadn't touched in minutes, the steam rising in delicate wisps, barely perceptible in the dim light. Outside, the wind picked up, groaning, as it moved through the branches. It wasn't a normal wind. No, this wind carried a strange quality, a whispering, like voices muffled by a thick fog. They couldn't quite make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Something, someone, was out there. The sound had an odd cadence, a rhythm to it that reminded them of murmured conversation. But there was no one else in the house. The house creaked in the silence. The sound was faint but persistent. The floorboards beneath them groaned as if settling under the weight of an invisible presence. They leaned forward, staring into the window, their reflection mingling with the night, their face barely visible in the faint candlelight. A faint tapping sound echoed from the far corner of the room, like a finger lightly drumming on wood. They turned, half expecting to see the cat they had never owned, or perhaps an animal that had wandered inside without them noticing. But there was nothing except the silence, the unnerving silence that had become thick in the room. They exhaled slowly, trying to steady their nerves. They told themselves it was nothing. Old houses made noises. It was a fact they knew well enough. But still, something about the house tonight made the air feel too tight, too dense. It was as though the walls themselves were leaning in, watching, listening. The candle flickered again, casting another distorted shadow that seemed to move of its own accord, elongating and shrinking in strange patterns. The floor creaked once more, louder this time, as though someone had walked across it, a slow, deliberate tread. They stood feeling a sudden unease creep up their legs, a cold shiver running down their spine, the strange sound from the floor. Had it been closer? No, it couldn't be. They were alone. Alone. Yet the sensation of something being there persisted. Just at the edge of their awareness, the hairs on the back of their neck stood on end. They approached the hallway, a strange compulsion drawing them toward the darkness beyond. But as they moved past the worn photograph on the wall, something made them freeze. The picture frame, an old, chipped wooden thing, was no longer hanging properly. It had shifted, slanting to one side, and a sharp crack echoed in the stillness as it finally gave way, falling to the floor with a dull thud. The sound echoed louder than it should, as if the house itself had exhaled in surprise. Heart pounding, they took a step toward the fallen frame. The silence pressed in around them like a thick blanket, muffling the usual sounds of the world beyond. the frame remained on the floor, untouched, as though it had fallen on its own accord. They bent to pick it up, their hands trembling, but hesitated. It was strange. Why did it feel like something had made it fall? Why did it seem as though the house was testing them? Just as they stood up, holding the frame in their hands, the candle flickered once more, and then went out, plunging the room into pitch blackness. They froze. The shadows that had once seemed a part of the flickering flame now seemed to swirl and shift, taking on new ominous shapes that writhed in the dark corners. A faint sound broke through the quiet. A scraping noise, soft but unmistakable, like something dragging along the floor just behind them. They spun around, but no one was there. The air seemed thicker now, almost stifling, and the hairs on their neck prickled in unison. The scrape came again, closer this time. They backed away, their pulse quickening, every instinct screaming for them to run, to get out. But the hallway stretched out before them, long and dark, the end lost to shadows. Then a loud bang echoed from outside, a sharp, jarring noise that made the floorboards beneath their feet vibrate. It was followed by a low rumble, like thunder, but too close, too unnatural. The ground shook briefly, like an earthquake, but there was no tremor, no movement in the earth. It was only a sound that didn't belong. Frozen in place, they glanced at the door, their heart hammering in their chest. Should they go check? What could be out there, making such a noise? For a long moment, they didn't move. The house, once so still, now felt as if it were holding its breath. Waiting, they could hear nothing but the pounding of their own heart. Something was out there, and it wasn't going away. The door was right there, but the silence, the unsettling quiet, was worse than the unknown outside. They remained motionless, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But no matter how long they stood there, no matter how still the world around them became, they couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was standing just beyond that door, waiting for them to make a move. And then, somewhere in the distance, a low, whispered voice seemed to call their name. The silence in the house had grown unbearable. The darkness beyond the window pressed in like a living thing, smothering all sense of comfort. The loud bang from outside still echoed in their ears, as if the night itself had struck a blow. The air in the room had grown colder, an icy draft seeping in through the cracks of the old house. They stood at the door, hand trembling on the knob, heart hammering in their chest. There was no turning back now. They had to know. They had to face whatever was out there. With a deep breath, they opened the door, the creaking of the hinges loud in the oppressive stillness. Cold air rushed in, sharp and biting, cutting through the thin fabric of their clothes. The night felt unnaturally deep, a void that stretched forever, swallowing up the world outside the door. The faint sound of the wind whispered through the trees, but it wasn't right. There was no breeze, and yet the branches swayed as if moved by unseen hands. The trees, dark and skeletal, loomed over the house like sentinels, their twisted forms casting long shadows that reached toward the door, clawing at the frame. The gravel beneath their feet crunched as they stepped outside, the sound too loud in the eerie quiet. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the forest, but it did little to cut through the darkness. The trees stood like silent giants, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. Their breath came out in visible puffs, the cold biting at their skin. They moved forward cautiously, as if the very ground might betray them at any moment. The whispers from the trees grew louder, almost as if they were beckoning them deeper into the forest, pulling them towards something unseen, something waiting. Then they saw it. Lying in the dirt, half hidden beneath the low-hanging branches of a twisted bush, was a doll. It was small, no more than a foot tall, its fabric torn and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. Its once bright clothes were now faded and stained, the fabric fraying at the edges. The doll's face was cracked, the porcelain smoothness shattered in places, and its glassy eyes were missing. Empty sockets stared back at them, as though it had once seen something it shouldn't have. The faintest trace of a smile was etched on its cracked face, a smile that felt wrong, unnatural. A shiver ran down their spine. Something about the doll felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this place, like it had been left here for a reason. But despite the unease pooling in their gut, they reached down and grabbed it, its lifeless form cold in their hands. As they turned to head back to the house, the whispers from the forest grew louder, almost impatient. The wind, if it could even be called that, seemed to swirl around them, tugging at their clothes, at their hair, as if urging them to hurry. But they couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching them, that the forest was aware of their every movement. The house felt distant as they made their way back, the porch steps creaking beneath their weight as they crossed the threshold and closed the door behind them. The warmth of the house didn't feel as comforting now. The air was still thick with something unspoken, something lingering just beneath the surface. They set the doll down on the small wooden table by the door. As they stepped back, the candlelight flickered again, casting fleeting shadows across the room. For a moment, the doll's empty eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, its broken face almost expectant. They shook their head, trying to push the thought away. It was just a doll. It couldn't hurt them, but as they turned away, they felt a strange sensation, a movement just at the corner of their vision. They spun back around, heart pounding, but the doll hadn't moved. It was still sitting on the table, its cracked face staring ahead, its empty eyes fixed on nothing. They laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. They were imagining things. The house was old, the air was heavy, and the darkness outside was playing tricks on them. That was all, just tricks. But as they walked further into the room, they caught a glimpse of something strange. The doll. It wasn't quite where they had left it. The angle of its head had shifted slightly, just enough for the empty sockets to seem even more unsettling. A small shift, barely noticeable, but enough to make their blood run cold. Had it moved on its own? Had they imagined it? They couldn't be sure. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just beyond their reach, grew stronger. The air felt colder, denser. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching further across the walls. Then the first footstep came. A soft, faint thud from upstairs, too distinct to be the house settling. It was the sound of a footstep, deliberate and slow, as if someone was walking around up there. But they were alone in the house. The house was empty, hadn't been lived in for years. There was no one else. The footstep came again, louder this time. A slow, methodical tread across the floor, Above them, their breath caught in their throat. It couldn't be. They moved toward the stairs, their feet heavy, as they ascended the creaky steps, each one groaning under their weight. Their mind raced with questions. Was it an animal? A trick of the house? But nothing made sense. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, to run. But they pressed on, each step dragging them deeper into the unknown. At the top of the stairs, the house stretched out before them, dark and still. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, and in the dim light, they could see the outline of something moving inside. The footsteps were no longer faint. They were clear, distinct, like someone or something was pacing in the attic, their steps growing louder with each passing moment. They approached the door, hand reaching for the knob. But just as their fingers brushed it, a loud bang echoed from above, followed by a series of sharp, quick footsteps, too fast, too erratic. The sound was unmistakable, the rush of feet moving in a frenzied pattern. The door slammed shut on its own, throwing them back. The candle flickered violently and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Their heart pounded in their chest, adrenaline surging as they scrambled to find a way to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The footsteps had stopped. The house had gone eerily silent again. And then, from somewhere far off, a voice called out to them, soft and familiar. Their name whispered through the darkness. It sounded like their own voice, but it couldn't be. No one else was here. In that moment, the quiet became deafening. The whispers from the forest, the crackling of the floorboards, the eerie footsteps above. They all seemed to merge into a single, unrelenting force, pressing in on them from all sides. Something was in the house. Something was watching. And it wasn't leaving. The days since the night outside had passed in a blur, each one feeling heavier than the last. The house, once silent and empty, had become a cage, the walls closing in with every step they took. The whispers were constant now, soft at first, almost a murmur at the back of their mind, but growing louder, insistent, impossible to ignore. No matter where they went, no matter what they did, they couldn't escape the feeling of being followed. They would turn a corner, and the whispers would follow. They would lie in bed, and the whispers would curl around them, soft and serpentine, as if they were speaking just beyond the reach of their hearing. Their name, always their name, carried on the wind. At first, they tried to dismiss it. Old houses creaked and groaned. The wind played tricks with sound, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. And no matter how they closed their eyes or pressed their hands over their ears, the whispers never stopped. A door slammed behind them, the sound sharp and sudden, rattling the house. They jumped, heart leaping into their throat. But when they turned, there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the fading candlelight. The door had closed on its own, the sound reverberating in the empty hallway. They stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door. The house had never been this alive before. It wasn't just the whispers. It was the way things moved when they weren't looking. The way shadows flickered and stretched unnaturally along the walls. It was the mirrors too. They had caught a glimpse of something in the reflection earlier. A shape that hadn't been there when they looked directly at it. They quickly turned away, but the feeling of eyes, cold and unblinking, remained. It was happening more often now. The mirrors, the reflections, they twisted, showing things that weren't there. Sometimes it was a figure in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, its features obscured, but watching, always watching. Other times, it was the faintest movement in the background, a shadow shifting across the surface, but no matter how fast they turned, no matter how hard they tried to avoid it, they always got a glimpse of something just outside the reach of their understanding. It was there, and it was coming closer. The house felt different now, heavier. The walls seemed to press in on them, from all sides, closing in like the grip of an unseen hand. Every corner felt darker, every room more suffocating. The whispers were always there, always near, like a constant hum under the surface of their thoughts. They didn't know how much more they could take. It was then, as they walked through the hallway, that they saw it. A bookshelf, standing almost too perfectly in the corner. Its wood dark and polished, its shelves heavy with old forgotten books. They had passed it a dozen times without a second thought. But now something was different. There was something about it, something that drew them in. The bookshelf seemed to beckon, its presence almost as if it were alive, pulling them closer. Without thinking, they reached out, their fingers brushing against the spines of the old books. And then, with a soft creak, the bookshelf shifted. A hidden staircase. Behind the books, hidden in plain sight, was a narrow wooden door that opened with a low groan, revealing the dark shape of a staircase descending into the bowels of the house. A cold draft rushed up from below, a chill that made their skin prickle. Fear clamped around their chest. They shouldn't go down there. Every instinct screamed at them to turn away, to leave it alone. But curiosity, dark, insatiable curiosity, pushed them forward. What was down there? What had they just uncovered? The whispers grew louder, almost mocking, as they took the first step onto the creaking wood, the staircase bending and groaning under their weight. They couldn't turn back now. The staircase descended deep into the earth, the shadows growing thicker with every step. The air grew damp and heavy. The smell of rot and mildew thickened their nostrils. The basement was worse than they imagined. The stone walls were cold, damp to the touch, covered in layers of moss and strange, ancient symbols. They couldn't read them, but they felt as though the symbols were watching them, alive in some way. The symbols twisted, their lines looping and curling into impossible shapes, as though they had been drawn by something otherworldly. The air was stifling, thick with the scent of mold and decay. The floor was uneven, cracked in places as if the house had been built over something older, something forgotten. The silence in the basement was oppressive, the kind of silence that felt like it had weight, pressing in on them from all sides. They moved deeper into the room, their eyes scanning the space, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. And then they saw it. A large wooden chest sitting in the corner, almost as if it had been waiting for them. The chest was old, covered in dust, its surface worn and scratched with age. It was locked, but the lock was rusted and frail, as if it hadn't been touched in years. A strange compulsion surged through them. They had to open it. They had to know what was inside. They knelt before the chest, their hands shaking as they worked the lock free. The wood creaked as they lifted the lid, and the smell that rushed out from inside was thick, ancient, a musty odor, like something long forgotten. Inside the chest was a pile of yellowed papers and leather-bound books, their pages fragile and brittle. They reached for one of the books, its cover embossed with symbols they couldn't recognize. As they opened the book, their eyes fell on the words, the ancient script curling across the pages, written in a language that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And then they found it. A journal. The handwriting was frantic, jagged, as if the author had written in a hurry, as if they were trying to escape something. It spoke of a curse tied to the forest that surrounded the house. The journal detailed the history of the family who had once lived there, a family who had made a pact with something dark and ancient that lived in the forest. The curse had been passed down through the generations, binding the family to the forest, to the house. It spoke of the doll, the same doll that they had found outside, and how it had been a marker, a symbol of the curse. The journal described how the family had tried to escape, but they never could. The forest, the curse, it always pulled them back. It always took them. The final words of the journal were scrawled in panic, the ink smeared in places. It spoke of a final sacrifice, a price that had to be paid to break the curse, a price that could never be avoided. The journal didn't say what the price was, but it didn't need to. They slammed the journal shut, their heart racing. This couldn't be real. It was too much. But the whispers were louder now, insistent, rising in pitch until they were deafening. Suddenly, from upstairs, a scream, a sharp, blood-curdling cry that shattered the air. Their body went cold. Without thinking, they bolted up the stairs, their feet pounding on the creaky wood. They burst into their room, heart racing, eyes scanning frantically. And there, sitting on their bed, was the doll. The same doll they had found outside. Its eyes, empty before, now seemed to gleam in the dim light. Its cracked smile was wider, more sinister, and it was staring straight at them. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a cacophony of voices that drowned out all thought. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. They could feel it now, the weight of something unseen pressing in on them. They backed away slowly, heart pounding, eyes locked on the doll. And then, just as they turned to flee, a cold hand brushed against their shoulder. The house had become unbearable. The walls felt like they were closing in. The whispers louder now, like the breath of some unseen thing at their neck. They couldn't sleep, couldn't think without feeling the weight of eyes watching from every corner. The doll, its cracked smile stretching wider every time they looked away, seemed to mock them, its empty eyes never blinking. And the forest, always there, always lurking beyond the house. It wasn't just the whispers that called them now. It was the forest itself. It was as though something inside the trees was reaching for them, pulling them toward it, beckoning them deeper into its shadowed heart. The wind carried voices, strange and distorted, like children laughing in the distance. But when they looked, no one was ever there. The trees themselves, gnarled and twisted, began to take on a new shape in their mind, their bark and branches forming faces, half-formed, distorted expressions that stared at them from every angle. The longer they stayed in the house, the more the forest felt alive, its presence suffocating, waiting. They knew they shouldn't go into the forest. Every part of them screamed that it was wrong, that it was dangerous, that they were being led into something ancient and dark. But it was too much. They had to know. They had to understand. And so, In the dead of night, with only the thin beam of a flashlight to guide them, they stepped out onto the porch, feeling the chill of the air cut into their skin. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into their bones, but they could feel the pull of the forest, stronger than ever. It whispered to them in a language they couldn't understand, its voice low and beckoning, wrapping around them like a chain. They hesitated, standing at the edge of the forest, the trees looming like silent giants in the distance. There was no moon tonight, and the stars were hidden behind a veil of thick clouds, leaving only the oppressive darkness. The trees stood in rows, black and twisted, their branches reaching out like arms to pull them in. With a deep breath, they stepped forward, the ground soft beneath their feet, almost too soft, like walking on flesh. Each step felt wrong, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath them, and the further they walked, the more the sense of being watched grew. The trees seemed to shift in the corners of their vision, twisting, curling in strange ways, their limbs bending unnaturally. Faces appeared in the bark, human faces, eyes wide with terror or twisted in grotesque smiles. Their expressions changed as they moved, as though the trees were alive, reacting to their every movement. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the stranger it became. The air grew heavy, thick with a sense of something ancient, something older than the trees themselves. The smell of decay hung in the air, mingling with the damp earth beneath their feet. The forest seemed to close in on them, the trees leaning toward them, as if trying to envelop them in their shadows. And then, the sound of children's laughter, faint at first, like the echoes of a dream, but then clearer, closer. They froze, heart pounding in their chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. The sound of laughter, high-pitched and innocent, was unmistakable. But there were no children here. No one at all. "Hello?" they called, their voice trembling in the cold air. "Is someone there?" Silence answered them. They continued forward, the flashlight flickering in the thick darkness. Every step felt like it was taking them deeper into the heart of the forest, into the grip of something that didn't want them to leave. The laughter continued, growing louder now, but there was no source. It bounced off the trees, echoing around them in a maddening chorus. They clutched the flashlight tighter, feeling the tremor in their hands. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was overwhelming. And then they saw it. A circle of stones, weathered and ancient, stood in the middle of the clearing, arranged in a perfect ring. The stones were covered in strange carvings, symbols that pulsed with an unnatural energy. They didn't recognize the language, but they could feel it, like a vibration in their bones, an energy that hummed in the air. The ground around the circle seemed to pulse with life, as though the earth itself was breathing. Their eyes traced the stones, searching for something, anything that might explain the strange, suffocating energy in the air. And then, from behind the circle, they saw it. A shadow. It was tall and indistinct, its shape shifting in the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. It stood still, motionless, watching them from behind the stones. Its form was blurry like smoke or fog, but its eyes, two gleaming points of light, were fixed on them with an intensity that froze them to the spot. The laughter stopped. The air grew still. The shadow took a step forward. Panic surged through them, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They wanted to run, to turn and flee back to the safety of the house, but their feet wouldn't move. It was as though the ground had solidified beneath them, binding them to the spot. The shadow moved again, stepping into the clearing, its shape becoming clearer, still formless, but more defined now. It was tall, too tall for any human figure, and its eyes gleamed with a strange, unnatural light. The air around it shimmered, distorted, as though the very fabric of reality was bending. It did not speak, it did not move, it just watched. The flashlight flickered. Number. They tried to turn it on again, but the beam was weak, dimming with every flicker. They fumbled with the switch, their hands shaking violently, their heart pounding in their chest. The shadow was closer now. It was moving slowly, deliberately, as though it was in no hurry. Its form seemed to ripple, as if it were made of darkness itself, its edges blurring in and out of focus. And then the light died. Complete darkness, no moon, no stars, just the blackness of the forest pressing in on them, swallowing them whole. They stood frozen, their heart thundering in their chest, their breath shallow. The shadow was still there. They could feel it, its presence surrounding them, suffocating them. They could hear something moving in the darkness, footsteps too soft to be real, but they could feel them. A breath, cold and wet, brushed against their ear. And then, in the pitch black, a voice, low, guttural, and ancient, whispered their name. The darkness of the forest pressed in on them like a weight, suffocating and all-consuming. The shadow behind the circle of stones, its eyes burning through the blackness, had not moved. Yet its presence lingered like a poison in the air. Every breath felt labored, every step an effort against the invisible force pulling them deeper into the abyss. The laughter, once so close, had stopped completely, leaving only the sound of their racing heartbeat in the thick silence. They didn't know how much time had passed, how long they had stood frozen in place. But the dread, the crushing fear, was still there. The whispering had returned too, soft at first, like a murmur at the back of their mind, but growing louder, more insistent, until it became a constant hum in their ears. They couldn't stand it anymore. With trembling hands, they turned on their flashlight again. The beam weak but steady enough to push the darkness back just a little. The shadow, the figure behind the stones, was gone. No longer standing in the clearing, its presence somehow worse for its absence. The whispers seemed to crawl from the earth itself now, from the very trees, as if the forest had swallowed the figure whole and was now exhaling it back in fragments. Half-formed memories of something ancient, something predatory. They turned, their feet heavy, their body pulled toward the house, towards safety. But the forest was vast, its trees thick with secrets, and no matter how far they walked, they always seemed to return to the same place, the center, the heart of it all. That's when they saw it. A cabin, abandoned and hidden in the thick brush. Its walls were dark with age, the roof sagging as if it had been long forgotten. Something about it was different from the rest of the forest. The air around the cabin felt colder, heavier, like it was absorbing the very essence of the forest itself. They approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The whispering still a constant presence in the back of their mind. The door was ajar, as if waiting for them, and despite every warning that screamed within them, they stepped inside. The cabin was dark, the faintest slivers of moonlight streaming in through cracks in the walls and roof, casting long, twisted shadows on the floor. The air inside was thick, stale, and the smell of rot hung in the air like a blanket, suffocating every breath. Their flashlight flickered, the beam weak against the overwhelming darkness. The room was sparse, save for a table in the center, cluttered with old, yellowed papers and what looked like a worn, leather-bound diary. The floor creaked beneath their feet as they moved closer to the table, their heart racing in their chest. The diary. They reached out, their fingers trembling as they opened the cover. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough, scratched, jagged, as though written in a frenzy. The story inside was one of desperation. The diary belonged to someone who had been trapped in this place, trapped by the same curse that had begun to haunt them. The words were a frantic account of a family that had once lived here, how they had been drawn into the forest just like they had been, how the whispers had begun to plague them, how the trees themselves seemed to shift and watch them. There were no names in the diary, no faces, just an account of events spiraling out of control, as if the writer was trying to make sense of the madness before it overtook them. The last entry was a chilling one. It's here. It's always been here. The forest has taken everything. I'm the last one left. I can hear the footsteps coming from below. The whispers won't stop. The ground is moving. It's in the walls. I have to hide. I have to leave, but the doors are sealed. Please, someone help me. I can't see it, but I feel it breathing down my neck. It knows my name. The words ended abruptly. The page was torn, as if someone had ripped the last part out in a frenzy. But it didn't matter. The message was clear. They were not the first to fall victim to this curse, and they would not be the last. A noise from beneath the floor made them freeze. A soft creak, like something moving in the darkness below. The whispers seemed to grow louder, closer. They didn't know what it was, didn't want to know, but they couldn't leave. Not yet. Something was calling them deeper into the cabin, into the dark places that had been hidden for so long. They walked cautiously across the room, toward the corner where the creaking sound had come from. The floorboards were warped, the wood dark with age and grime. But as they neared the far wall, they saw it. A loose board, slightly raised. They knelt down, fingers shaking as they pried the board up, the wood groaning in protest. Beneath it, a gap, just wide enough for them to slip their hand through. And then they felt it. A draft, cold and damp, coming from below. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, and the whispers grew louder, frantic, more insistent, as if the forest itself was reaching for them. With one last breath, they pulled the board away completely, revealing a dark opening, a tunnel, barely big enough for them to crawl through. The air that rushed up from the tunnel was thick with decay, with the stench of something long dead. They hesitated, but the pull was stronger now. The whispers, the promise of something hidden, something buried beneath the earth. It was calling them. Without thinking, they lowered themselves into the tunnel. The passage was narrow, the walls rough and jagged, scraping against their arms as they crawled deeper into the earth. The air grew colder the further they went, thick with the scent of decay, of rot. And as they moved forward, they began to see them. Bones, animal bones, scattered haphazardly along the floor, as if something had dragged the bodies down here and left them to rot. They could barely make out the shapes in the dark. but the bones seemed endless, stretching on for miles. As they crawled, the sound of scratching, like nails dragging across stone, echoed through the tunnel. The whispers were louder now, so loud they could barely think, wrapping around their thoughts like a vice. The walls were covered in scratches, claw marks, long, deep gouges that looked fresh, as if something had been digging, trying to get out. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, winding deeper into the earth, the air getting thicker with each passing moment. Their breath was shallow, heart racing in their chest, but still they pressed on, drawn forward by the need to understand, to see what was at the end. And then they saw it. A door. It stood at the end of the tunnel, black and pulsating, as if it were alive. The wood seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, like a chest rising and falling with every breath. It was old, rotting, and yet it seemed untouched by time, as if it had always been there, waiting. The whispers reached a crescendo. They stepped forward, heart pounding in their chest, and reached for the door. It was locked. The cold metal of the handle was smooth beneath their hand, but it didn't turn. There was no way to open it. But the door seemed to know they were there. It throbbed, pulsed, the wood shuddering, as if it were alive, as if it were reaching for them, calling them closer. And then, in the silence that followed, the whispers stopped. The air grew still. The door creaked, and behind it, they heard it, a voice, deep and ancient, echoing from the other side. "Come in." The door creaked again, an unnerving sound that seemed to reverberate through the tunnel, shaking the very air around them. It was as if the door itself was alive, listening, waiting for them to make the next move. The whispers had died down to a low hum, but the weight of the silence that followed was suffocating. Every instinct in their body screamed to turn back, to flee, but something, some unexplainable pull, kept them rooted in place. The handle turned. The door, heavy and ancient, groaned as it slowly swung open. A gust of cold air rushed out from the darkness behind it, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth, mold, and something far older. The room beyond the door was shrouded in an eerie, pale, bluish light that seemed to come from no obvious source. It cast long, twisted shadows on the walls, making everything look distorted, wrong. Stepping into the room, their feet moved as if on their own, drawn forward by the presence of something waiting for them. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if it was alive, as though the very space around them was breathing. The walls were covered in symbols, ancient, arcane, and constantly shifting. The patterns were hypnotic, rippling like liquid across the stone. The designs felt familiar, but they couldn't place them, couldn't understand their meaning. They seemed to swirl and pulse as though they were alive, feeding off the presence of the one who entered. As they stepped deeper into the room, they saw them. Figures. Ghostly, ethereal, and transparent. They floated in the corners of the room, their forms wavering like smoke in the light. Their faces were twisted in agony, contorted with pain and sorrow. Some of them wept silently, their tears falling without sound, while others screamed, but their mouths moved without making a noise. Their hollow eyes, wide with fear, seemed to follow the characters' every movement. The figures raised their hands toward them, pointing accusingly, as if blaming them for something they couldn't understand. A sense of guilt, foreign yet familiar, surged within them. It wasn't just that these spirits were angry or lost. It was as if they knew the character, knew something deep and buried, something that had been hidden away for years. The room was silent except for the faint, ethereal cries of the spirits and the constant whispering which now seemed to come from all directions. The whispers weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, feelings, memories, slipping into their mind like shards of glass. They tried to block them out, tried to focus on the figures, but the memories kept creeping in, persistent and unavoidable. The first memory came in a rush, an image of a face, someone they knew, someone they had forgotten. It was their mother, but not the way they remembered her. This was younger, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep that it was suffocating. The memory shifted again, this time to their father's voice, but it was distorted, twisted with pain. Then the faces of others, family members, distant relatives, emerged, each one filled with the same agonized expression. It was as though they had all been waiting for the character to remember something they had long buried. Then, like a flash of lightning, the truth hit them. It wasn't just the curse. It wasn't just the forest. It was their own blood, their own lineage that had drawn them here. They were a part of something far darker than they had ever realized. A secret hidden for generations. Something that had been erased from the family's history. They were connected to the forest, to the curse, to everything that had happened in this place. And they had been all along. It was no accident they had returned. The figure closest to them raised its hand and pointed, its transparent form flickering like a candle about to extinguish. It opened its mouth, but no words came. Only the sound of wind whistling through an empty room. The character's head spun, the ground beneath them shifting as their mind was flooded with fragmented memories. They were there, standing at the center of it all, caught between the living and the dead. Their hands shook as they pressed them against their temples, trying to block out the memories, trying to hold on to reality. The whispers were growing louder now, more frantic, drowning out everything else. Their name was being repeated over and over, louder and louder, until it felt like it was coming from inside their skull, screaming at them. Suddenly, a cold, damp hand brushed against their own. They jerked back, eyes wide, but there was nothing there. No figure, no spirit. Only the silence of the room, thick and stifling. The figures had vanished. The walls, now still and lifeless, seemed to close in on them, shrinking the space. The glowing light that had filled the room began to flicker, dimming and flickering like a dying flame. The air grew colder with every passing second. The walls seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm, like a heartbeat in the darkness. The pressure in the room increased, as though the very air was becoming thicker, heavier, suffocating them. And then they heard it. The sound that they had feared. The sound that had haunted them since they first set foot in the forest. A door slammed shut behind them. The room, once vast and open, was now a confined space. And no matter how hard they turned, there was no way out. The whispers had turned into screams, their name now echoing through the room in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They reached for the door they had just come through, but their fingers touched nothing but cold stone. The walls, once lined with symbols, now appeared to be closing in, shifting with a malicious intent, sealing them inside. In the distance, a sound, a low, guttural growl, began to reverberate through the walls. It was coming closer, closer, growing louder with each passing second. Their heart raced. The fear that had been gnawing at them since the moment they stepped into this nightmare finally came to a head. They were trapped. The whispers had become a cacophony, screaming their name as if the very spirits of the forest were clawing at them, urging them to remember, to understand. But they couldn't. They couldn't understand what it all meant, why it was happening to them. And then, in the very center of the room, the ground cracked. A ripple ran through the stone, a web of fractures spreading outward. As though the earth itself was unraveling, from the cracks, shadows emerged, dark, twisting forms that slithered like liquid, reaching out toward them with unnatural speed. The cold hand touched them again, but this time, it wasn't just a hand. It was something more. The figure, now materialized from the shadows, emerged fully from the cracks in the floor. It was no longer a faint wisp of light, but something solid. Its face twisted in an expression of pure malice. It stepped toward them, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its mouth opening wide to reveal jagged teeth. The whispers from the walls converged into a single, bone-chilling scream. And in that moment, they realized the truth. They were never meant to leave. The room, the whispers, the memories, they had all been leading them here, leading them to the heart of the curse. There was no escape, only the abyss, only the darkness that awaited them, and the shadows were closing in. The darkness around them was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive force that clung to their skin like oil. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe, stretching across the room in unnatural ways. As if they were alive, the air grew thick with a cold dampness that stung their lungs with each breath, and the whispers that had once been a distant, insistent hum were now sharp, clear, and cruel. Every direction they turned, every step they took, the voices followed, pressing in from every angle, surrounding them. "You did this." The words rang out, sharp and accusatory, as if spoken from every shadow, every corner, every inch of the suffocating room. "You are the cause of all this." Their heart hammered in their chest, and they spun in a frantic circle, eyes wide, searching the blackness for the source of the voices. But there was nothing tangible, just the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in. They tried to move, to run, but their feet felt heavy, as if the very ground beneath them had turned to thick tar, pulling them back, refusing to let them go. Every step they took sank deeper, as though the earth itself was trying to drag them down into its depths. "You brought it here." The voices seemed to scream, their words piercing the silence like shards of glass. "Your family, your blood, it's all your fault." They froze, their legs trembling under them. The accusation cut through them like a blade, leaving a deep wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. Their fault? Had it always been their fault? Had they known deep down that they were the reason for everything? The whispers, the spirits, the curse that clung to this place like a cancer? They thought back to the memories they had unlocked, to the things they had tried to forget. They had tried to push them down, but now the memories surged forth, more vivid than ever before. The family secret, the bloodline, the darkness, the pact that had been made generations ago, the thing that had been buried in silence and shame, all for the sake of maintaining the illusion of normalcy. They were the heirs to that curse, the ones who would eventually be forced to face it. But had they known it would come to this? Had they truly understood the cost? Their head throbbed, the whispers now a cacophony that scrambled their thoughts, making everything feel unreal, like a nightmare from which they couldn't wake. They wanted to scream, to tear at their own skin to escape the crushing weight of guilt and fear, but they were trapped. Trapped in the darkness, trapped by their own memories, by their own blood. "You cannot escape," the voices continued, each one growing louder, more insistent. "You are the one who will finish what was started. You are the one who will either save or destroy us all." A figure materialized from the shadows, stepping slowly into view, its form flickering like a dying flame. The figure was tall, indistinct at first, its features blurred and shifting in the gloom. But then, as it drew closer, its shape became clearer. A person, a face they knew all too well. The figure stepped forward into the pale, flickering light, and their breath caught in their throat. It was them, or at least it looked like them. The same eyes, the same shape of the face, the same haunted expression that had long been buried in their memories. But this was no reflection. This was no mere echo of their past. This was something else. Something that had been waiting in the darkness. Something that had been calling to them all along. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a cruel, mocking twist of the lips, one that made their blood run cold. The eyes, they were not their own. There was something twisted in them, something dark and ancient, something that didn't belong to them at all. "So you finally remembered, haven't you?" The figure spoke, its voice a rasp that echoed off the walls of the dark room. "All these years, buried deep inside you, and now it all comes rushing back, doesn't it?" The character's heart pounded in their chest, a sickening sense of dread flooding their veins. What do you want from me?" The figure laughed, the sound hollow and echoing. "What I want?" It leaned closer, the features of its face twisting into a grotesque parody of their own. "What I want is for you to choose. The choice you were always meant to make. The choice that your bloodline has always had to face." The words sent a chill straight through their bones. The room seemed to close in on them, the darkness thickening, as if the walls themselves were closing in. "You're not the first to come here," the figure continued. "Your family has been here before, just as you are now. Each generation, someone must make a choice. Will you stay and suffer forever, doomed to live in this endless nightmare, trapped by the curse that your ancestors set into motion, or..." The figure's eyes gleamed, a dark hunger in them. "Will you do what must be done? Will you perform the terrible act that will break the curse, but at a price?" The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The character's mind spun. The choice. What was the terrible act? What price would they have to pay? The figure's eyes burned into theirs. "Only one will survive," it whispered. "And it's always been your blood that chooses. What will you do? Will you end it? Or will you let it consume you?" The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows creeping closer. The ground beneath their feet began to pulse, as though it were alive, as though it were waiting for them to make their decision. The room seemed to walk, the walls bending and twisting in unnatural ways, as if the very space itself was responding to their fear, their indecision. A deep gnawing feeling settled in their gut. They were faced with something far worse than they had imagined. The The curse was not just something that had been thrust upon them. It was their legacy, something they had inherited by blood, by fate. There was no escaping it, no denying it. Whatever choice they made, they would have to live with it for the rest of their life. The figure reached out, its hand ghostly and cold, and placed it gently on their shoulder. "You will be tested." Its voice was low, dark, almost hypnotic. "And only then will you know what you're truly capable of, what you are willing to sacrifice." The figure faded back into the darkness, leaving them alone, standing at the edge of an abyss that threatened to swallow them whole. The whispers were louder now, screaming their name, demanding their decision, urging them to choose. Stay and suffer, or break the curse. But at what cost? The broom seemed to spin, the ground beneath them shifting like quicksand as the darkness closed in around them, suffocating them, until all they could hear was the deafening echo of their own name. The choice was theirs, but in that moment, they didn't feel like they had any choice at all. The air was thick with a sense of dread, the kind that settled deep in your bones, making your limbs heavy and your heart beat with a rhythmic terror. The darkness around them was no longer just an absence of light. It was a presence in itself, something alive, watching, waiting. The shadows clung to the walls, twisting and curling like serpents, as if the very fabric of the room had become one with the void. The whispers had faded into an oppressive silence, but the weight of them still lingered, pressing down on them like an unseen hand. They could feel the pulse of the curse, the thrum of it vibrating through the floor, through the very air itself. It was a heartbeat, a living, breathing thing that could not be outrun. And then, like the opening of a long-forgotten door, the memories came rushing back. It started with flashes, small fragmented glimpses of something long buried, something they had forced themselves to forget. The face of their mother, younger, smiling, but there was something off about her eyes, a strange coldness that didn't belong. Then their father's voice, but twisted, distorted, like something had corrupted it. Family gatherings, the warmth of home, the sound of laughter, all of it was tainted now, overshadowed by a single horrifying truth. Their family had made a deal with something ancient and evil, something that had always been there, waiting in the dark spaces between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The forest, the curse, the whispers, they were all part of it. Their ancestors had sought power, wealth, protection, or maybe something more. And in exchange, they had given up a part of themselves, a part of their soul. The pact had bound their family to this place, to this curse, to this fate that now threatened to consume them. And they were the final piece, the last link in the chain. The realization hit them like a hammer, shattering the fragile veneer of normalcy they had clung to all their life. All their fears, all the strange feelings, all the things they had felt but could never fully understand, clicked into place. It wasn't just the house, it wasn't just the forest, it was them. They were the one who had been chosen, the one who had been bound by blood, by fate, by the terrible legacy that had been passed down through generations. They had always known, in the back of their mind, that there was something wrong with their family. That strange heaviness they had always felt, that gnawing sense of something out of place, was the curse. It had been there all along, waiting for them to finally remember. The air grew colder still, the temperature plummeting so quickly that their breath came out in thick, frosty clouds. And then, before them, something shifted. The shadows that had once clung to the walls now gathered together, swirling in a vortex, coalescing into a form. A figure, tall, black as pitch, its shape constantly shifting, as though it were made of the very darkness itself. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer just an apparition. This was it. This was the thing that had haunted their bloodline for centuries. It stepped forward, its form becoming more solid with each passing second. Its face was featureless, but its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, burned with an unnatural light, glowing faintly like embers in the dark. It did not move like a human, nor did it speak with a human voice. It was something far older, far more terrifying. At last, the voice boomed, not in words, but in a sense of understanding, an echo that resonated deep within their chest. It was both familiar and foreign, as though it had always been a part of them. The final piece has arrived, the heir, the one who will complete the bargain. The words were cold, detached, yet they echoed with a promise. And that promise, the freedom it offered, was something they could feel in their very soul. I have waited for this moment, the entity continued, its voice curling around them like smoke. Your ancestors knew this day would come, and now you will choose the final sacrifice. A chill ran through them, their legs trembling beneath them. Their hands reached up to steady themselves, but the walls seemed to close in. This was it. This was the end. Everything they had feared, everything they had fought against, had led to this moment. There was no more running, no more hiding. You have two choices, the entity intoned. You can leave this place, walk free, and sever the curse. But there is a price, a terrible price. The creature's form flickered, the shadows of its body swirling and twisting like dark water in a storm. To break the cycle, to free your family from the chains of the pact, someone must die. Someone who is connected to you. Someone you love. The room seemed to spin around them. They staggered back, their mind racing. This was a choice they could never be prepared for. Or, the creature paused, its glowing eyes locking onto theirs, as if weighing their very soul. You can stay. You can remain here, bound by the curse forever. Your family's legacy intact. No death, no sacrifice, but you will be trapped. Forever. The weight of the decision crushed them. The room seemed to pulse with the thrum of the curse, the very walls alive with anticipation. The whispers had returned, now loud and clear, speaking in 100 different voices, each one desperate, pleading. Save us, end it, let it go. Their chest tightened, their breath shallow. They tried to process everything, what they had learned, what was at stake, their family, their life, their future. All of it hung in the balance. If they chose to end the curse, it would come at the cost of someone they loved. If they chose to stay, they would be bound forever to the forest, to the pact, to the entity that had waited so long for this moment. Their mind raced. The memories, the voices, the choice. It was all too much. But in that moment, they realized something. There was no right choice. They had always been trapped by the curse. Whether they chose to end it or let it consume them, the chains would remain. The figure before them was not just a demon, not just a spirit. It was the embodiment of their family's sins, their bloodline's choices. There was no escaping it. They were bound to it. And now they had to make their decision. The creature's glowing eyes bored into theirs, waiting. The air was thick with tension, the silence unbearable. It reached out toward them, its fingers stretching, the shadows crawling across the floor. But then, in a voice that felt like their own, the figure spoke again, low and guttural. Choose. And with that, the weight of the decision, of the terrible price, settled over them like a tombstone. They took a step forward, trembling. The choice was theirs to make. But as they lifted their hand, reaching out to the darkness, their mind shattered, and the room spun into oblivion. The forest was behind them, but it felt like it had never really let go. The trees that had once loomed tall and foreboding now seemed distant, their twisted branches only a faint memory in the night. The cold air no longer pressed in around them, yet it lingered in their lungs, like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. They had made it out, somehow, but something inside them had shifted, something irreparable, as if they were no longer entirely themselves. The path to the house was quieter than it had ever been, but the silence felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The wind whispered through the trees, but instead of bringing relief, it brought a gnawing sense of unease. It felt as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake, to falter. And the whispers, they never stopped. The character kept hearing them, low, insistent murmurs that slid into their thoughts uninvited. At first, they had tried to ignore them, thinking it was the residual effect of the curse, the echo of the thing they had faced in the depths of the forest. But the whispers didn't fade. They only grew louder, more persistent. They could hear them at night when they tried to sleep, calling their name, urging them to listen, to remember. During the day, they would hear soft, hissing voices in the background, as if someone was speaking to them from just beyond the edge of their vision. And the shadows, there were more of them now. At first, it was just an occasional flicker out of the corner of their eye. But soon, they started to see them more clearly. Dark shapes lingering in the corners of rooms, on the edge of hallways, always just beyond their reach. When they turned to face them, they were gone. But the feeling remained. There was something moving, something watching, something that shouldn't be there. They had returned to the house, but it wasn't the same. The silence was thick and oppressive now, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The air felt colder, as if the house had absorbed the very essence of the curse that had once bound them to the forest. The once familiar walls now seemed foreign, as if they were staring at them through someone else's eyes. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the air felt magnified. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It had become something else. Something that knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The doll was gone. They had thought it was a trick of the mind, the flickers, the slight movements. But now, the doll was nowhere to be found. The bed where it had once sat was empty. The spot where it had always been felt wrong, like a wound on the fabric of the room. Yet, even without the doll, the strange events didn't cease. The picture frames on the walls continued to shift, their angles changing when they weren't looking. The floorboards creaked when no one was walking. The air would grow heavy, cold, and then lighten again, as if something unseen was moving through the house, passing through walls, leaving a chill behind. There were moments when the whispers grew so loud that they were impossible to ignore. their voices overlapping, clawing at the character's mind. You can't escape. It never ends. You are ours. They tried to go about their days, but the house was no longer a refuge. It felt like a trap. Every corner, every shadow seemed to be watching them, waiting for them to slip up, to make the wrong move. Even the mirrors, which had once offered a reflection of reality, now seemed to distort the truth, bending the character's image in unsettling ways. And then one night, it happened. They were standing in front of the bathroom mirror, running their hands through their hair, trying to steady themselves. The house felt unusually still tonight, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. The whispers had quieted for a brief moment, but their absence only made the silence more oppressive. The feeling of being watched crept over them again, so strongly that it made their skin prickle. They looked into the mirror, staring at their own reflection, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at them from within. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering light of a candle in the corner. Then, from behind them, they saw what? At first, it was just a movement, a shadow flickering across the edge of their reflection. But as they turned, it solidified, becoming more defined, more real. There, standing just behind them, was a figure, a shape that shouldn't have been there, a dark, indistinct silhouette. The figure was tall, its form shifting, as though it were made of shadow and smoke, its features blurred beyond recognition. The air around it grew colder, and the whispers surged louder than ever, filling their mind, drowning out all thoughts. The character's breath caught in their throat. They could feel the figure's presence now, a heavy weight pressing down on them, as if it had always been there, waiting for them to notice. The figure in the mirror was watching them, but they couldn't see its eyes. It didn't need eyes. It was something far worse. The hairs on the back of their neck stood on end as the shadow seemed to move closer, impossibly close, and their reflection began to blur at the edges. The figure's form began to shift, taking on the vague outline of a face, but it wasn't their own. It was something darker, something twisted. They froze. Their hand trembled as it gripped the sink, knuckles white with the force of it. Their heart hammered in their chest, each beat more frantic than the last. The figure in the mirror grinned, a cruel, stretching smile that wasn't a smile at all, but a twisted mockery of one. The whispers in their mind reached a deafening crescendo, each voice screaming at them, accusing them, pulling them into madness. You're one of us now. There's no escape. It will never let you go. The reflection reached toward them, its hand extending from the mirror as if it could cross the boundary between the glass and the real world. But when the character stepped back, the shadow's hand froze, its fingers inching toward them, the tip of its cold, dark fingers barely grazing the glass. The character spun around, their breath ragged and uneven. But when they turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. The room was silent again, eerily silent, but the terror remained. The feeling of something lurking just out of sight, something that would never let them go. And as they stood there, trembling, eyes wide, staring at their own reflection, they could swear they saw the faintest movement from the corner of their vision. The reflection smiled. It was them, but it wasn't them. They stumbled backward, heart pounding in their chest, the fear now a tangible thing crawling up their spine. But the shadows were still there, The whispers were still there, and the house, this house that had once been their home, had become something else entirely. They weren't alone anymore. Not in the house, not in the world, not in their own skin. And as they turned away from the mirror, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong, they realized something chilling. It had always been watching them, and it always would be.